Thanksgiving is a ritual built on certainty, the certainty that the family will gather. Those old tensions can be muted for a single day. Proximity itself can substitute for trust. On November 26, 2009, those assumptions collapsed inside a family home in Jupiter, Florida. A Thanksgiving gathering ended with 4 family members dead, 1 relative wounded, and a suspect who disappeared before police arrived. This was not random violence. It was not a stranger's intrusion. It was a crime that occurred inside a family system already under strain, intensified by ritual, proximity, and long-standing grievance. Here, we examine not only what happened, but how psychological pressure, family history, and systemic limits converged on a holiday built to enforce closeness. The Thanksgiving gathering included approximately 17 relatives, spanning multiple generations. Among them was Paul Michael Merhage, age 35, a family member who had been staying with relatives. According to police statements and contemporaneous reporting, Michael was present earlier in the evening. At some point, he left the home. There was no documented family-wide argument erupting in real time. No public confrontation that escalated in front of witnesses. Later that night, Michael returned armed and opened fire inside the residence. When law enforcement arrived, 4 family members were dead. A 5th relative had been shot and survived. The victims were Michaela Sitton, age 6, was Michael's second cousin and the only child of the hosts, Jim and Muriel Sitton. She was asleep in her bed when she was shot. Lisa Merhaig Knight, age 33, is one of Michael's twin sisters. She was pregnant at the time of her death. Carla Merhaig, age 33, Michael's other twin sister, a real estate agent based in Miami. Raymond Joseph, age 76, was Michael's aunt and the mother of Muriel Sitton. The victims represented 3 generations of the same family: a sleeping child, a pregnant woman, an elderly grandmother. The scope of the loss immediately shaped how investigators and prosecutors would approach the case. Michael fled before police arrived, triggering an intensive statewide manhunt. Thanksgiving is not just a holiday. It is a ritual, and rituals impose structure. They demand closeness before trust is restored. They assume reconciliation without requiring it. In forensic psychology, holidays are often described as compression points, moments where emotional distance is forcibly collapsed. Individuals who have been living on the margins of family life are required to re-enter intimate spaces without mediation, repair, or exit routes. In the Jupiter case, this mattered. The gathering was ceremonial, not casual. Roles were fixed: hosts and guests, adults and children, dependents and providers. Within that structure, imbalance becomes visible. Post-crime reporting and court records described Michael as financially unstable, emotionally isolated, and dependent on relatives. These conditions do not cause violence, but they can intensify internal strain when paired with ritual-enforced proximity. Thanksgiving amplifies pressure in specific ways. Gratitude conflicts with resentment. Family success invites comparison. Togetherness becomes an obligation. Ritual assumes harmony before it exists. Everyone is seated at the same table as if emotional repair has already occurred. From an investigative standpoint, this reframes the timeline. The violence did not erupt during Thanksgiving as an argument spiraled. It emerged around Thanksgiving, within the psychological environment that the ritual created. Thanksgiving did not cause the violence, but it removed distance. And for some individuals, distance is the last stabilizer. As investigators reconstructed the hours surrounding the shooting, witness testimony introduced a chilling detail. Multiple witnesses recalled Michael muttering, "I've been waiting 20 years to do this." This statement, cited in investigative reporting, shifted the psychological framing of the crime. Rather than a sudden snap, the evidence pointed toward a long-brewing grievance. Thanksgiving was not the spark. It was the compression point, the moment when a fixation collided with forced intimacy. Court records further revealed that family conflict was not new. Years before the shooting, Michael and his twin sister Carla had each sought restraining orders against one another. Restraining orders within families are rare, not because violence is rare, but because families often avoid formalizing internal threat. When legal boundaries are erected between siblings, it signals a breakdown of informal containment, the unspoken rules that usually keep conflict from escalating. Thanksgiving brought together people whose relationships had already been legally defined as dangerous, under the expectation of civility and gratitude. For weeks, Michael remained at large as authorities pursued leads across Florida. National media coverage expanded the search. In January 2010, a tip connected to a broadcast of America's Most Wanted led law enforcement to Michael's location. He was arrested without incident at a hotel. With the suspect in custody, the case moved from pursuit to prosecution. Michael was convicted on multiple counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, reflecting both the number of victims and the presence of a child and an unborn life. Moving on with Case 2. On November 22, 2012, Thanksgiving Day in Little Falls, multiple histories converged inside a single house. Two teenagers arrived carrying the weight of their own decisions. A homeowner waited, carrying months of suspicion, anger, and anticipation. By nightfall, Haley Kiefer, 18, and Nicholas Brady, 17, were dead, shot inside that house by Byron Smith, a retired corrections officer who would later claim he feared for his life. This is not just a story about a shooting. It is a case about what happens when fear is rehearsed, when control replaces restraint, and when the law is forced to decide where self-defense ends and murder begins. Months before Thanksgiving, Byron Smith reported multiple burglaries at his home. Tools were missing, windows showed signs of disturbance. Law enforcement documented the incidents, but no suspects were identified and no arrests were made. Smith believed the same individuals would return. This belief shaped everything that followed. Smith was not a civilian unfamiliar with incarceration or violence. He had spent years working for the Minnesota Department of Corrections. He understood criminal behavior, institutional power, and the psychology of control. And as the break-ins continued unresolved, his focus narrowed. Rather than viewing the threat as intermittent, Smith began to view it as inevitable. This process is often described as anticipatory threat rehearsal in forensic psychology. The mind repeatedly runs the same scenario. Someone will come back until the imagined future begins to feel certain. This does not require mental illness. It requires time, fixation, and a sense that external systems have failed to intervene. By Thanksgiving Day, Smith was waiting. The house was dark, blinds were drawn, firearms were accessible. Smith positioned himself where he believed an intruder would enter. The holiday did not interrupt the trajectory. It simply provided the moment when it would finally resolve. That afternoon, Haley Kiefer entered the home through a basement window. Nicholas Brady followed later. Both were unarmed. Both were committing a burglary. At this point, Minnesota law allows a homeowner to use force, potentially even deadly force, only while facing an immediate and ongoing threat. Smith fired. What the jury would later focus on was not the legality of an initial defensive act, but what followed after the threat no longer existed. Smith did not immediately call 911. He remained inside the house. He moved the bodies. He spoke aloud. Audio recording devices inside the residence captured his voice after the shootings. These recordings were not staged narrations and were not made to manufacture evidence. They documented Smith's post-shooting conduct and were admitted at trial. Forensic evidence showed both victims suffered multiple gunshot wounds. Medical testimony supported the conclusion that at least one victim was incapacitated before fatal shots were delivered. This distinction is critical. Self-defense is not a blanket justification. It is conditional. Once a threat is neutralized, once an intruder is incapacitated, the legal authority to use deadly force ends. Prosecutors argued that Smith crossed that line. They pointed to three elements repeatedly: the delay in contacting emergency services, the movement of the bodies, the statements captured on audio, reflecting awareness rather than panic. From a behavioral perspective, This aligns with what scholars describe as retrospective moral licensing, the belief that an initial justified act authorizes subsequent actions that would otherwise be impermissible. Smith did not describe chaos. He described certainty. In 2014, a Morrison County jury rejected Smith's self-defense claim. He was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree premeditated murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict did not rest on sympathy for the victims or hostility toward homeowners. It rested on sequence and control. The jury concluded that whatever fear existed at the moment of entry no longer justified what followed. The Minnesota Court of Appeals later affirmed the conviction, emphasizing that the evidence supported intentional, deliberate killing rather than lawful defense. This was not a rejection of the right to protect one's home. It was a declaration that fear does not grant unlimited authority. Long after the details fade, the people behind these stories still deserve to be remembered. A simple like and subscribe helps keep their truth alive and their voices from disappearing. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. On to Case 3. Police did not know the motive, not immediately, not publicly, and not even after identifying a suspect. That absence was not a minor gap in the investigation. It was the central problem investigators faced from the very beginning. On the morning of November 28, 2024, law enforcement officials in San Antonio were confronted with a familiar but deeply unsettling reality. 2 people were dead, 4 people had been shot, and there was no clear explanation for why it happened. In violent crime investigations, motive often functions as an organizing principle. It gives shape to chaos. It allows investigators, prosecutors, and the public to place events into a coherent narrative. But in this case, motive was missing. What remained were outcomes without context and consequences without a clearly articulated cause. The basic facts were stark. Everyone involved knew each other. They were not strangers brought together by chance or criminal opportunity. They had spent the night together inside the same home. There was no forced entry, no sign of a break-in, no evidence of a random intrusion from outside the residence. There was no obvious external threat that could easily explain the violence. And yet, just after 8 a.m., inside a home on the 600 block of Potomac Street, gunfire erupted with fatal consequences. The emergency call came in on Thanksgiving morning, a time when police departments already operate under the strain of limited staffing and heightened call volume. Responding officers entered a private residence and encountered a scene that immediately complicated the investigation. 4 people had been shot. 2 men were pronounced dead at the scene. 2 others were wounded and transported to the hospital, their survival ensuring that the event would not remain silent, but also introducing the complexities of trauma, memory, and interpretation. The deceased were later identified as 24-year-old Lavonte Drummer Sims and 27-year-old Devin Lavallee. Their deaths transformed the incident from a violent encounter into a homicide investigation with the highest possible stakes. What they could not provide, because they no longer could, was insight into how the moment unfolded or what emotional dynamics preceded it. Within a short time, police detained a suspect nearby. He was identified as Michael Moore, 20 years old. The speed of the detention answered one question quickly: who law enforcement believed was responsible for the gunfire. But it did not answer the more difficult question of why the shooting occurred in the first place. Investigators confirmed several critical facts early in the process. All individuals involved were acquainted. They had spent the night together in the residence. The shooting occurred as the suspect was leaving the house, not during a forced confrontation initiated from outside. Police also stated that alcohol may have been present, a detail that does not assign blame, but does establish conditions that forensic psychologists recognize as relevant to impaired judgment, emotional volatility, and reduced inhibition. What investigators could not immediately provide and did not publicly offer even after charges were filed was a motive. In criminal cases, motive often provides psychological and narrative closure. Without it, the scene resists interpretation. It becomes harder to categorize, harder to explain, and harder to reduce to familiar patterns. This was not a robbery. Nothing indicated theft or financial gain. It was not a domestic dispute clearly defined by established relationship labels. It was not an argument overheard by neighbors with a clear beginning, escalation, and conclusion. There were no publicly identified threats, no prior incidents immediately cited to frame the violence. Instead, it was a moment of rupture, an eruption without a publicly named cause. When motive is absent, investigators are often forced to widen their lens. Rather than focusing on a single triggering event, they examine conditions, environment, proximity, emotional pressure, and in this case, the timing mattered. Holidays matter. Thanksgiving compresses people into shared space. It demands participation. It expects gratitude, whether or not gratitude is genuinely felt. In many social environments, gratitude is not optional. It is performed. You are expected to be thankful, expected to minimize discomfort, expected to avoid confrontation for the sake of the occasion. Emotional honesty becomes subordinate to social expectation. Psychologically, this matters. When gratitude is demanded rather than authentic, honesty becomes disruptive. A neutral remark can be interpreted as disrespect. Silence can be read as hostility. Withdrawal can feel like rejection. Boundaries, especially emotional ones, can be experienced as provocation. This dynamic is known as the performance of gratitude, a social contract enforced not through words, but through ritual and expectation. Conflict does not disappear in these spaces. It is postponed, pressed down, forced into silence. And silence does not resolve tension. It preserves it. From a forensic perspective, this helps explain why violence in familiar settings can feel sudden to outsiders. The argument does not begin that morning. The morning is simply when accumulated pressure runs out of places to go. Police later stated that they had not identified a clear motive at the time charges were filed. That absence does not mean there was no reason. It means the reason was not easily translated into legal language. Violence often begins not with rage, but with a perceived violation of unspoken rules, rules about respect, hierarchy, belonging, or emotional obligation. With motive unresolved, investigators turn to what they could prove: ballistics, trajectories, sequence, positioning. These elements reconstruct movement rather than meaning. They establish who stood where, who was shot first, who fell, and who survived long enough to speak. Survivor testimony became central, but trauma complicates memory. Fear reshapes detail. Self-protection can alter emphasis without intention. Detectives corroborated statements with physical evidence, knowing that truth in cases like this is rarely singular or clean. The law does not require motive to file charges. It requires action, outcome, and responsibility. Prosecutors ultimately charged Michael Moore with capital murder in the deaths of Levante drummer Sims and Devin Lavallee, as well as aggravated assault related to the two surviving victims. The justice system moved forward not because the motive was clear, but because the consequences were undeniable. The case moves through the legal system, and we move to Case 4. Chesterfield County, Virginia, a suburban community just south of Richmond, built around routine, familiarity, and the expectation that family life remains private. On the night of November 23, 2017, inside one of these homes, Thanksgiving ended with 3 people dead: a wife, her adult daughter, and the daughter's boyfriend. The man charged was not an intruder. He lived in the house. Christopher R. Gaddis, a 58-year-old youth pastor, husband, and stepfather, was taken into custody at the scene without resistance. By the next morning, Chesterfield County was no longer documenting a holiday gathering. It was documenting a triple homicide. This is not a story about sudden madness. It is a story about silence, fear, and what happens when conflict is postponed instead of confronted. The home sat in a typical residential neighborhood. Nothing about it suggested imminent violence. Inside lived 4 adults navigating a blended family structure: Christopher Gaddis lived there with his wife, Jeanette Gaddis, also 58. Jeanette's daughter, Candace Kunze, 30, lived in the home with her boyfriend, Andrew Boothorn, 36. Gaddis worked as a youth pastor, a role associated with guidance, mentorship, and moral authority. But domestic authority does not always align with public identity. According to later court testimony, the marriage between Christopher and Jeanette was marked by frequent arguments. The tension was not theoretical. It was known. At some point before Thanksgiving, Jeanette Gaddis had asked an adult nephew to hide a gun, telling him she was afraid Christopher might use it during one of their disputes. That detail matters, because it reframes the household not as stable, but as managed, held together through caution rather than resolution. Thanksgiving intensified that management. It brought everyone into the same room. It removed distance, and it eliminated the ability to disengage quietly. Silence is often mistaken for peace. In many families, problems are not solved. They are postponed. Arguments are softened, grievances deferred, boundaries blurred, under the banner of keeping things calm. But silence does not eliminate conflict. It delays it. According to court records and reporting, on Thanksgiving night, the family was playing a board game together inside the home. This detail is deceptively ordinary. Board games imply cooperation, turn-taking, rules, shared focus. But they also require proximity, and they leave no room to withdraw without explanation. In households where conflict has been managed through avoidance, moments like this can become pressure points. Nothing explodes immediately. Pressure accumulates quietly, and when authority is assumed rather than negotiated, resistance can feel like a threat, not to comfort, but to identity. Sometime later that night, the pressure broke. Emergency responders were called to the home. Inside, police found 3 people dead from gunshot wounds: Jeanette Gaddis, Candace Kunze, and Andrew Boothorn. Investigators later confirmed a crucial forensic detail. All 3 victims had been shot in the back. There was no sign of forced entry, no evidence of an external threat. Christopher Gaddis was present in the home and was taken into custody without incident. Initially, Gaddis told police that he felt threatened and claimed that the victims all came after me. That statement would later collide with the physical evidence. Shots fired into the backs of the victims contradicted a narrative of immediate self-defense. Prosecutors would argue that the evidence did not support a claim of an advancing threat. Gaddis was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and 3 counts of using a firearm in the commission of a felony. He was denied bond. No outside motive, financial, criminal, or conspiratorial, was identified. This was domestic violence contained entirely within the household. In August 2018, Christopher Gaddis pleaded guilty in Chesterfield County Circuit Court. There was no jury trial. The plea eliminated the need for prosecutors to publicly reconstruct every second of the shooting, including testimony from surviving relatives about prior fear and conflict. Gaddis was sentenced to 58 years in prison. Not a symbolic punishment, not a short-term sentence, a term structured to ensure he would likely spend the rest of his life incarcerated. There was no claim of innocence at sentencing, no dispute over responsibility. The legal system closed the case. Some truths only survive because someone chooses to keep listening and sharing. Liking this video and subscribing to the channel helps these stories travel further and ensures they're never lost to silence. Case 5. On May 27, 1999, a Michigan judge sentenced Seth Pravacki to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was 18 years old. The sentence followed a no-contest plea to 5 counts of first-degree murder and 5 firearm charges. There was no jury, no prolonged trial narrative, only a legal conclusion that the crimes demonstrated planning, intent, and permanence. But sentencing is never the end of a story. It is the moment the justice system decides what the violence means. This sentence declared that youth no longer mattered. Whatever forces shaped the crime were secondary to its outcome. That the individual before the court was beyond rehabilitation, To understand how a family reached that point and why the law responded with finality, we have to rewind not to the moment of violence, but to the structure that allowed it to form unseen. In late November 1998, the Pravacki family gathered at their home during Thanksgiving weekend. There were no emergency calls, no reports of a holiday argument spilling into the street, no visible crisis. That absence is central. Family-based mass violence often develops inside rigid hierarchies rather than chaotic households, according to forensic psychology. Authority is enforced, not negotiated. Respect is equated with obedience. Conflict is controlled, not resolved. Seth Pravacki was legally an adult, but still living under parental authority. According to reporting and court-referenced accounts, conflict between Seth and his father had intensified over time, centering on control and a threatened eviction. For adolescents and late teenagers, authority threats inside the home are uniquely destabilizing, especially when they occur in front of others. Humiliation in this context does not require shouting. It can be quiet, correction at the table, dismissal in front of siblings, reminders of power delivered with an audience present. Psychologically, this matters because humiliation is a status injury. It signals not just disapproval, but erasure, an announcement of who holds power and who does not. In tightly controlled family systems, there is no legitimate path to recover status. Arguing escalates punishment. Withdrawal confirms defiance. Silence becomes survival. But silence does not dissolve grievance. It compresses it. This is how resentment becomes private narrative, not explosive rage, not visible rebellion, but internal rehearsal, imagining restoration through means no longer governed by family rules. On Sunday, November 29, 1998, 5 people inside the Pravacki home were shot and killed. Stephen Pravacki, Seth's father; Linda Pravacki, his mother; John J. Pravacki, his grandfather; Jedediah Pravacki, his brother; April Boss, Jedediah's 19-year-old girlfriend. The weapon was a .22 caliber Ruger handgun, accessible, familiar, and not stolen. There were no signs of forced entry. Autopsies later confirmed that most victims were shot once in the head, indicating execution-style precision. Seth Pravacki's grandfather was shot twice, a deviation investigators noted but could not definitively attribute to panic or resistance. From a forensic standpoint, the pattern suggested instrumental violence, not chaos. There was no evidence of a struggle moving through the house, no widespread overkill. The scene reflected control and familiarity with both victims and the environment. After the killings, Seth contacted a friend, Stephen Wallace, and asked for help. Together, they attempted to clean the scene and stage the house to resemble a robbery. This detail is psychologically significant. Staging indicates post-offense cognition. It reflects awareness of consequence and an attempt, however flawed, to manage narrative. This was not dissociation. It was deliberation after the fact. Seth fled the scene and hid in a nearby barn. He was located approximately 13 hours later. When questioned by law enforcement, he confessed. In 1999, Seth Pravacki entered a no-contest plea. The prosecution emphasized planning, execution, and staging. The defense referenced youth and family environment, but the court sided with permanence. The sentence, life without parole, reflected the legal climate of the time. Certain crimes outweighed developmental context. Years later, however, the narrative shifted. In a 2007 letter written from prison, Pravacki claimed that he had been under the influence of LSD during the murders. Law enforcement and prosecutors remained skeptical. The claim did not appear in his initial confession, was unsupported by toxicology evidence, and surfaced only after years of incarceration. Investigators noted that late-emerging intoxication claims are common in post-conviction narratives and are treated cautiously, especially when the crime itself demonstrates sequencing, weapon control, and post-offense staging. From an investigative perspective, psychedelic intoxication does not explain targeted execution, selective victim order, or efforts to disguise the scene. Even taken at face value, the claim does not alter the underlying structure of the violence. On July 15, 2010, Seth Pravacki's life sentence ended abruptly during a failed escape attempt from Kinross Correctional Facility in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. After 11 years in prison, Pravacki and two fellow inmates, Andrew Ross and Dennis McDonald, both convicted murderers, hijacked a prison semi-truck used for food transport. They overpowered the driver and tried to force the truck through the facility's double security fences. The vehicle broke through the inner fence but became trapped in razor wire along the outer perimeter. When the truck stalled, the three men fled on foot. A perimeter guard issued repeated commands to stop. Ross and McDonald surrendered immediately, but Pravacki continued running toward nearby woods. The guard fired a single shot, striking Pravacki in the head. He was pronounced dead at the scene at age 30. Coming up next is Case 6. After the killings, Joel Guy Jr. left Tennessee. For several days, he was not publicly identified as a suspect. There were no headlines, no confirmed victims, and no official narrative, only concern from extended family members who had been unable to reach his parents. On November 28, 2016, police conducting a welfare check entered a home in Knoxville. Inside, they discovered the bodies of Joel and Lisa Guy. The scene immediately indicated not only homicide but preparation, materials, tools, and handwritten notes that investigators would later describe as a detailed record of planning. By the time the crime was discovered, Joel Guy Jr. was already in Baton Rouge. He was placed under surveillance and arrested on November 29, 2016, as he was entering his vehicle at his apartment complex. This was not a spontaneous roadside capture. It was a controlled arrest, carried out after investigators had identified him as the primary suspect. This case is often reduced to a single sentence. A son killed his parents after learning they planned to end his financial support. That description is accurate, but incomplete, because the defining feature of this crime is not emotional collapse. It is how familiarity, unresolved dependence, and entitlement combined into calculated violence. Thanksgiving is commonly framed as a pause in conflict, a ritual of reassurance. Yet psychological research offers a more complicated picture. Familiar environments do not always calm. Sometimes they reactivate old relational roles and unresolved grievances precisely because defenses are lowered. This story begins after the violence. Its causes formed long before. Psychological research does not support the idea that familiar settings automatically cause violence. What it does show, consistently, is that familiar environments can cue emotional memory and learned relational patterns, especially when those patterns were never fully renegotiated in adulthood. For Joel Guy Jr., his parents' home was not simply a location. It was the setting where financial dependence had continued well beyond adolescence. By 2016, Guy Jr. was 28 years old. Court records and testimony showed ongoing difficulty maintaining employment and long-term reliance on his parents for financial support. According to the prosecution, his parents had reached a firm decision that support would end. From a developmental and forensic psychology perspective, this decision carried more weight than a simple financial boundary. Identity and autonomy are closely linked. When an adult identity is structured around continued support, the withdrawal of that support may be experienced not as a limit, but as a threat to stability, status, or survival. Research on emotional memory demonstrates that unresolved grievances do not disappear. They remain latent and can be activated when present conditions resemble earlier emotional circumstances. Familiar places, family hierarchies, and authority relationships can function as cues, not just for emotion, but for older interpretations of power and control. Thanksgiving brought these cues together: the family home, parental authority, and confirmation that financial dependence would end. Importantly, there was no public confrontation. Guests attended the holiday gathering and left without witnessing conflict. The absence of visible tension does not indicate the absence of internal strain. After the murders, investigators discovered handwritten notes belonging to Joel Guy Jr. These documents did not describe distress or confusion. They outlined steps, lists, sequences, financial outcomes. This distinction is essential. Forensic psychology differentiates between expressive violence, driven by emotional overload, and instrumental violence, where harm is used to achieve a specific objective. The evidence in this case aligns strongly with the latter. The notes detailed plans related to accessing assets, including the family home and financial resources. Violence was framed internally not as loss of control, but as a solution to a perceived problem. Research on cognitive rehearsal helps explain why this matters. Repeated mental simulation of an action, especially one connected to entitlement or restoration of control, reduces psychological resistance to carrying it out. Planning does not create violent intent, but it normalizes the behavior internally. Crucially, this process does not require psychosis or detachment from reality. The available evidence indicates that Guy Jr. understood the consequences of his actions and proceeded anyway. This understanding separates calculation from impulse. The crime scene reinforced the interpretation of instrumental violence. Investigators determined that the killings occurred inside the home and were followed by efforts to conceal and transport remains. There was no sign of forced entry and no evidence of an external offender. Nothing about the scene suggested panic or confusion. It reflected task-oriented behavior. In forensic terms, this matters because post-crime actions often reveal motive more clearly than the act itself. The presence of tools, materials, and written plans pointed toward preparation rather than escalation. This was not violence that unfolded because control was lost. It was violence enacted to regain control. After the discovery of the crime scene on November 28th, investigators traced Joel Guy Jr.'s movements to Baton Rouge. Surveillance was established, and he was arrested on November 29, 2016, without incident. He did not deny involvement. During trial proceedings, prosecutors emphasized premeditation, relying heavily on the handwritten notes, the financial motive, and the structured actions taken after the killings. These elements formed a coherent narrative of intent. The defense raised mental health considerations. However, the jury's focus remained on planning, awareness, and execution. In October 2020, Joel Guy Jr. was convicted on multiple counts, including first-degree murder, and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. We now move to Case 7. The verdict reflected a legal conclusion that the violence was deliberate, not impulsive. The shooting began with a confrontation. On Thanksgiving Day, November 22, 2018, inside the Riverchase Galleria, an argument escalated between two men. One of them, Aaron Martez Daquan Brown, pulled a handgun and opened fire inside the mall. Multiple shots were discharged in a densely packed public space. Two people were struck. One was a young man wounded by direct gunfire. The other was a 12-year-old girl hit by a stray bullet as panic spread through the building. The gunfire shattered the environment instantly. What had been a place of post-holiday shopping became a closed system of fear, loud, crowded, and disorienting. Within moments, the shooter fled, and into the vacuum left by that chaos stepped another man, Emantic Fitzgerald Bradford Jr., whose presence would soon be fatally misinterpreted. Bradford was 21 years old, visiting the mall that evening. He was legally carrying a handgun, permitted under Alabama law. He had recently completed U.S. Army basic training and was home for the holiday. When the gunfire erupted, Bradford drew his firearm. There is no evidence he fired it. There is no evidence he threatened anyone. There is no evidence he knew who the shooter was. But context collapsed faster than facts could form. Inside an enclosed space, perception compresses. A man holding a gun becomes the story, regardless of sequence. Officers from the Hoover Police Department arrived within minutes, responding to reports of an active shooter inside a packed mall. They had no clear suspect description, no confirmation of how many shooters were involved, and no reliable account of who had fled. They encountered Bradford holding a firearm near one of the injured victims. An officer, later identified in civil filings as David Alexander, fired. Bradford was struck multiple times and transported to a hospital where he was pronounced dead. An independent autopsy commissioned by Bradford's family later concluded he was shot 3 times from behind, including a fatal wound to the head. The actual shooter, Aaron Brown, was gone. What happened next was not just a tactical error, it was a psychological inevitability inside a sealed environment. Psychologists call it perceptual narrowing. Under extreme stress, the brain discards nuance and clings to the most salient threat cue. In this case, that cue was a visible firearm. This is known as the weapon focus effect, a documented phenomenon where attention locks onto a weapon and ignores surrounding detail. Who fired first? Who is fleeing? Who is reacting? The mall amplified this effect. Bright lights, echoing acoustics, multiple levels, hundreds of bodies moving without coordination. This is containment without exit. No one disengages because disengagement feels dangerous. Civilians freeze. Witnesses hesitate. Responders feel pressure to act immediately because waiting feels like failure. In these moments, systems do not slow down. They close the narrative as fast as possible. And the fastest story available was this: armed man equals shooter. In the immediate aftermath, police incorrectly identified Bradford as the shooter. That claim spread rapidly before being walked back as investigators confirmed he had not fired the initial shots. The real shooter, Aaron Brown, was arrested days later in Georgia and charged with attempted murder. Bradford was publicly cleared, but only after he was dead. The next decision point did not involve a jury. In 2019, the Alabama Attorney General's office reviewed the case and declined to present it to a grand jury. The office determined that the officer's actions were justified and not criminal under Alabama law. That determination rested on one standard: objective reasonableness, what the officer believed at the moment, not what was later proven to be true. Civil lawsuits followed. Bradford's family sued the officer, the city, and other parties. Courts ultimately dismissed the claims. Legally, the case ended there. Case 8. Asmaram and Tewodros Ghebreselassie arrived at a Thanksgiving gathering on November 23, 2006, not as strangers, but as family. The dinner took place inside a private residence in Oakland, California. It was framed as a moment of continuity, an attempt to preserve family ties strained by loss, disagreement, and unspoken resentment. The setting carried the familiar expectations of a holiday meal: restraint, politeness, and the hope that unresolved issues could remain contained for one evening. They did not. By the end of the night, 3 members of their sister-in-law's family were dead. According to prosecutors, the brothers did not arrive together. They argued that Tewodros Ghebreselassie entered the home first, presenting himself as conciliatory and maintaining access under the appearance of normal family relations. Later, prosecutors alleged he used a cell phone to signal Asmaram Ghebreselassie, opening the door for him once the gathering was underway. The violence that followed was not the product of a spontaneous argument that night. It did not originate at the dinner table. Its origins stretched back 8 months earlier, to March 2006, when the brothers' sibling, Abraham Twold, died suddenly. Abraham's death was examined by medical professionals and ruled a natural death. No homicide was found. No criminal charges were filed. From the standpoint of the state, the matter was resolved. For the brothers, it was not. Research in grief psychology shows that official explanations do not always bring psychological closure, particularly when a death feels abrupt or emotionally destabilizing. In such cases, some individuals reject institutional conclusions and seek alternative explanations that better align with their internal sense of meaning. Investigators later stated that Asmaram and Tewodros Ghebreselassie refused to accept the medical ruling. Instead, they came to believe that Abraham's death involved wrongdoing by members of his wife's family, including Winta Mahari. This belief was not supported by forensic evidence. There were no toxicology findings, no medical contradictions, and no witness testimony linking the family to Abraham's death. The suspicion did not grow from proof. It grew from interpretation. This distinction matters because belief behaves differently from uncertainty. Uncertainty keeps questions open. Belief closes them. Belief organizes memory, filters information, and stabilizes narrative. Over time, belief no longer feels tentative. It feels settled. By the fall of 2006, investigators concluded that the brothers were no longer questioning the cause of Abraham's death. They were operating as though responsibility had already been assigned. Criminologist Per-Olof Wikström's situational action theory helps explain how this internal certainty translated into action. The theory proposes that crime becomes possible when personal moral rules align with situational pressure. Belief supplies moral permission. Opportunity supplies access. Thanksgiving created that opportunity. Family gatherings differ fundamentally from private disputes. Social psychologist Robert Zayonk demonstrated that the presence of others increases physiological arousal, a phenomenon known as social facilitation. This arousal does not create emotion. It intensifies emotions that already exist. In emotionally charged contexts, heightened arousal compresses decision-making time. Reflection narrows. Inhibitory controls weaken. Family settings amplify this effect through identity pressure. Sociologist Irving Goffman showed that when individuals believe they are being observed, behavior becomes performative. Actions are weighed not only by outcome, but by how they appear to others. Backing down in private can feel neutral. Backing down in front of family can feel like concession. This is not abstract pride. It is the perception that exit routes are disappearing. Prosecutors later argued that the Thanksgiving gathering placed long-held grievances into a setting where restraint carried a higher psychological cost. Whether actual witnesses were present or merely anticipated, the effect was the same. The perceived audience raised the internal price of disengagement. Psychologist Roy Baumeister's research on ego threat supports this dynamic. Aggression becomes more likely when a person's self-image feels publicly challenged. Importantly, an audience does not cause violence. It accelerates escalation once conflict is activated. That acceleration matters, because when time collapses, internal brakes fail. The crime scene reflected control rather than chaos. Investigators reconstructed movements, timing, and victim selection through physical evidence and witness accounts. The sequence of events indicated deliberation rather than impulsive disorder. Law enforcement quickly identified Asmerom and Tewodros Ghebreselassie as suspects. Both were arrested, charged, and prosecuted for the killings. At trial, the defense argued that the brothers believed the victims were responsible for Abraham Tewolde's death. However, no evidence was introduced to substantiate that belief. The medical ruling of natural death remained unchallenged by qualified experts. No forensic contradiction was presented. The prosecution framed the killings as retaliatory violence driven by belief rather than proof, belief maintained in defiance of medical findings and unsupported by evidence. In 2011, a jury convicted both brothers of murder. Sentencing reflected the loss of 3 lives taken during what had been framed as a family gathering. But the legal process did not end with those convictions. Asmerom Ghebreselassie, identified by prosecutors as the shooter, remains incarcerated. His conviction was upheld on appeal. He is serving life in prison without the possibility of parole. Tewodros Ghebreselassie's legal path diverged. In 2015, an appellate court overturned his murder conviction. The ruling did not rest on newly discovered evidence or a reevaluation of the facts. It rested on procedure. Judges found that a detective's trial testimony improperly commented on Tewodros's credibility, an assessment reserved exclusively for the jury. Because that boundary was crossed, the conviction could not stand. Prosecutors were given the option to retry the case. They declined. In 2016, instead of facing a second murder trial, Tewodros Ghebreselassie entered a no-contest plea to 3 counts of voluntary manslaughter. The plea did not constitute an admission of guilt, but it allowed the case to be resolved without a retrial. He was sentenced to 10 years in prison, time he had already served, and was released from custody. The divergence was necessary. The legal system did not revise the facts of the night. It did not validate the belief that motivated the violence. What it revised was the method by which responsibility could be assigned within the limits of evidence and due process. One brother remains imprisoned for life. The other was freed, not because belief was proven correct, but because procedure was violated. Case 9. The motive was not rage in the moment. The motive was permission. Permission to deceive. Permission to isolate. Permission to decide quietly and internally that other people's lives no longer imposed limits. That permission does not arrive suddenly. It forms gradually, reinforced by grievance, entitlement, or the belief that ordinary rules no longer apply. By the time violence becomes visible, restraint has already collapsed. Thanksgiving weekend in Killeen did not create that motive. It removed friction. Fewer people watching. Fewer routines operating at full strength. Long stretches of time where movement went unnoticed. What followed was not a single outburst. It was a 4-victim killing sequence carried out over 2 days, across multiple locations, involving planning, deception, movement, and escalation. This is not a story about losing control. It is a case study in what happens after control is deliberately surrendered. In the early morning hours of November 26, 2004, the day after Thanksgiving, Mohammed Amin Ramouni and Haitham Zayed drove to the parking lot of a local business in Killeen. They believed they were meeting a buyer interested in stereo equipment. This detail is not incidental. It is the mechanism of the crime. The meeting had been arranged in advance. The location was quiet. The timing minimized interruption. Ramouni and Zayed remained inside their vehicle, expecting a routine exchange. Instead, they were shot inside the car, an enclosed space where movement was restricted and escape was nearly impossible. From an investigative standpoint, this immediately ruled out spontaneity. There was no argument, no confrontation, no escalation driven by emotion. The victims were not challenged. They were lured. In forensic psychology, this pattern is classified as instrumental violence, violence used deliberately to accomplish an internal objective. Instrumental violence depends on planning and on an internal decision that deception is acceptable. After the 2 men were killed, the shooter left the scene. Critically, the violence did not end there. 2 days later, on November 27, 2004, the violence resurfaced in a different environment with different victims. Near a local lake in Killeen, Tiffany Dotson and Amanda Benefield, both teenage dancers, were killed. The first killings relied on deception and privacy. The second relied on momentum. Criminologists describe this progression as threshold erosion. Once violence has occurred, the psychological barrier to committing it again is lowered. Each act requires less internal resistance than the one before. Across the 2 days, investigators identified clear continuity, location selection, movement between scenes, and persistence after initial killings. Ballistic evidence, timelines, and witness statements allowed law enforcement to connect what initially appeared to be separate crimes into a single behavioral sequence. By this stage, motive no longer required a trigger. The internal justification had already been accepted. What remained was execution. When the case reached court, prosecutors did not focus on emotional narratives. They focused on behavior, planning, luring, weapon use, leaving scenes, returning to violence days later. The defendant, Richard Lee Tabler, was charged with capital murder. The defense argued emotional instability and impaired impulse control. Prosecutors argued deliberate action. Central to the defense case was the claim that Tabler suffered from Klinefelter syndrome, a chromosomal condition, XXY, sometimes associated with cognitive limitations, emotional dysregulation, and impulse control problems. Defense teams also presented evidence of severe mental illness, arguing that these conditions diminished his capacity for restraint. Courts rejected that framing. The reason was not dismissal of mental illness, but contradiction by the record. The killings involved planning. They involved deception rather than confrontation. They involved controlled movement between locations. They involved continuation after initial success. Legally, diminished impulse control could not coexist with the level of organization demonstrated across 4 killings and multiple environments. The jury agreed with the prosecution. Tabler was convicted and sentenced to death. The sentence was upheld on appeal. Courts repeatedly rejected claims that the violence was impulsive or situational. In legal terms, motive did not mitigate intent. For many capital cases, the story narrows after conviction. This one expanded. In 2008, while incarcerated on Texas death row, Tabler obtained a smuggled cell phone, a direct violation of prison security protocols. Using that phone, he made explicit death threats against John Whitmire, then chair of the Senate Criminal Justice Committee, which oversaw prison policy and funding. The response was extraordinary. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice ordered a system-wide lockdown across multiple prison units. Cells were searched. Movement was frozen. The incident prompted legislative scrutiny and exposed vulnerabilities in death row security. Behaviorally, this was not impulsive acting out. It followed the same structure seen in the murders. Hidden access, strategic timing, a specific target, maximum institutional disruption. Even under total confinement, Tabler demonstrated the same internal permission structure. Rules applied to others, not to him. The violence was symbolic rather than physical, but the mechanism was unchanged. Deception followed by assertion. Another unusual pattern emerged in the years that followed. Tabler repeatedly waived his appeals, then later reinstated them, a process known in capital punishment jurisprudence as volunteering for execution. At different points, he asked courts to hasten his death. At others, he reversed course and pursued additional review. Judges ordered repeated competency evaluations to determine whether his decisions were knowing, voluntary, and stable. This oscillation was not random. It mirrored the same pattern seen throughout the case. Control asserted, control relinquished, control reclaimed. Even in the appellate process, Tabler attempted to dictate the terms, when proceedings should end, when they should continue, and under whose authority. Ultimately, the courts ruled that his final waiver was competent and binding. On February 13, 2025, Richard Lee Tabler was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit, the state's primary execution facility. In his final statement, he addressed the families of the victims. He did not deny responsibility. He did not offer justification. He said, "I am sorry for the pain and suffering I caused you." Legally, the execution marked the completion of the judicial process. Appeals had been exhausted. The sentence imposed by the jury was carried out. And finally, we move into Case 10. Indianapolis, Indiana. Along North Shortridge Road, on the city's east side, Thanksgiving Day began without spectacle. Apartment buildings stood still. Doors opened for guests. Conversations carried the unremarkable rhythm of a holiday built around routine rather than anticipation. Inside one of those apartments, a dispute that appeared ordinary, small, even inconsequential, reached a point from which nothing could be corrected. By the end of the morning on November 23, 2023, 34-year-old Usman Gassama was dead. Responding officers would later find his body sitting upright outside the apartment building, a detail that would anchor both the investigation and the courtroom narrative that followed. Nearly 2 years later, Ephraim Edmondson was sentenced. This is not a story about chaos or randomness. It is a story about escalation, how a minor disagreement becomes fatal, and how the justice system interprets choice when time collapses into irreversibility. Shortly after 10 a.m., officers with the Indianapolis Metropolitan Police Department were dispatched to reports of gunfire near the 200 block of North Shortridge Road. What they encountered was not confusion, but aftermath. Gassama had suffered multiple gunshot wounds. Investigators observed a trail of blood droplets leading from outside the building into a nearby apartment. Spent shell casings were recovered at the scene. 4 witnesses were present, each offering fragments of the moments leading up to the shooting. Detectives quickly established that this was not a random encounter. Gassama and Ephraim Edmondson knew one another. According to witness statements later introduced at trial, the two men had been involved in an ongoing dispute in the days leading up to Thanksgiving. That morning, the disagreement resurfaced. Testimony described a confrontation that began verbally and escalated rapidly. At its center was a bottle of liquor, an object that, in isolation, carried no real consequence. But investigators understood early that the object itself was not the cause. What mattered was what it represented: perceived disrespect, control, and unresolved grievance. From a forensic psychology perspective, this pattern is familiar. Violence rarely begins with a weapon. It begins with interpretation, how individuals assign meaning to words and gestures under stress. Witnesses told police that Gassama had expressed fear in the days before Thanksgiving. He had shared concerns about Edmondson and the direction their conflict was taking. That fear would later become contextual, not as proof of intent, but as evidence that escalation was already underway. 2 gunshots ended the argument. Edmondson left the scene. Although Edmondson was identified quickly as a suspect, he was not immediately taken into custody. According to IMPD records, Edmondson was arrested on December 1, 2023, approximately 1 week after the shooting. He was taken into custody in the 300 block of North Shortridge Road, a short distance from where the killing occurred. This gap is necessary. Investigations do not happen in cinematic time. Even when a suspect is known, law enforcement must corroborate witness statements, secure physical evidence, and prepare charges that will withstand scrutiny in court. During questioning, Edmondson admitted to shooting Gassama during the altercation. From that point forward, the case centered not on whether a shooting occurred, but on how the law should interpret the act. Edmondson was charged with 3 felonies under Indiana law: murder, possession of a firearm by a serious violent felon, and residential entry. The firearm charge was pivotal. Edmondson was legally prohibited from possessing a gun. That prohibition exists to reduce the likelihood that volatile conflicts escalate into lethal outcomes. From a psychological standpoint, this case illustrates instrumental escalation, the moment when the presence of a weapon collapses restraint. Emotional arousal narrows perception. The brain prioritizes dominance and threat response over consequence. At trial, jurors heard testimony describing the progression of the argument, attempts by others to intervene, and Edmondson standing in the doorway after shots were fired. They examined forensic evidence indicating that the shooting occurred inside the apartment, not during an act of self-defense outside it. Jurors were not asked to decide whether the conflict felt intense. They were asked to decide whether Edmondson chose to use lethal force. That distinction sits at the core of forensic psychology and criminal law, understanding behavior without excusing it. In late September 2025, a jury returned a guilty verdict on all counts. Weeks later, in October 2025, the court imposed a 67-year prison sentence. During sentencing, Marion County Prosecutor Ryan Mears emphasized that the killing did not stem from a complex or extraordinary conflict. He described the dispute as simple and inconsequential, arguing that it became fatal only because Edmondson chose to introduce a firearm into a disagreement that otherwise would have ended without lasting harm. The emphasis was not on rage, it was on choice. As we close this case, remember that every case in this video are real human like you and me who should never be forgotten. If you value stories told with care and truth, please like the video and subscribe to help keep these voices alive.